Welcome to another SourceFuse Talking Out Cloud, our leadership chat series. I'm Liz Grint, Marketing Manager here at SourceFuse, and we're a strategic digital transformation company helping businesses evolve through cloud-native technologies. And we've been doing that for more than 18 years. Now, we're all very excited here at SourceFuse because just last week, we hit a huge milestone in our partnership with AWS and achieved Premier Tier Services status. We've been a day one AWS partner for almost a decade now. So with that in mind, I'm really pleased to be joined today by an AWS guest, Migration Workloads Specialist, Dries Endert, who can share some invaluable insights on the importance of planning and preparation prior to migrating workloads. In other words, the pre-assessment phase. So welcome, Dries.
Hi, Liz. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here with SourceFuse, especially given how much work I do with SourceFuse in my role. Yeah, super excited to get started and talk cloud.
Lovely. So, why don't we start with an introduction to your background and experience, especially how you came to be in your present role at AWS?
Yeah, sure thing. So I started at AWS almost 5 years ago, actually in Madrid. And I started off in a graduate program. So I sort of started my commercial role, kind of sales career here at AWS, very much at an entry level. And I was working primarily with what we call greenfield customers. So, you know, companies that are new to AWS, and I worked within the enterprise space. And as I spoke to customers that were new to the cloud, new to AWS, very much kind of running traditional IT infrastructures on premises, I started noticing the importance of understanding how to talk about Microsoft workloads, running those workloads in the cloud, and then further down the line, how AWS can help customers, optimize those workloads and modernize them. So even though I was in that sort of entry level kind of general sales role, very quickly I started, realizing, hey, if I can talk about these workloads and really sort of hone in on helping our customers migrate and modernize those workloads, you can have a lot of really constructive conversations with customers. So after that role, I ended up moving into a specialist role. So here within AWS, obviously we have hundreds of services, so we also have a lot of different specialists. And I started working on to a migration workload specialist role. So basically, what that means is I support our commercial teams speak to their customers about running Microsoft and VMware workloads on AWS.
Great stuff. Interesting history you've got there. So, Dries, when you start to work with a customer looking to migrate their workloads from on-prem to another cloud, to AWS, what would be the starting point? What AWS programs might be available that support those first steps?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think the first thing maybe to talk about here is, customers today have, that are not on AWS can be hosted in so many different ways. So just for the sake of simplicity, let's take more traditionally the examples of customers running on premises that, let's say, are virtualized with VMware at the hypervisor level and run Microsoft workloads on top of that. So that's Windows Server, SQL Server. If we take a traditional kind of IT infrastructure like that, the what we tend to do as a first step, and the program that will bring forward to our customers, is what's called the optimization and licensing assessment. Now, that is a program where you can essentially build your business case for migrating to the AWS cloud. We map, we run discovery tooling, and we can go into a little bit more depth on this, but we run discovery tooling. We do what's called a licensing health check. And what we can essentially do is get a really strong understanding of what customers have deployed in their existing IT infrastructure. And then we look at the utilization rates, that CPU utilization, RAM utilization, and then what we do is we right size that environment and map it to Amazon EC2. What we also do there when customers are looking to migrate is we also have a look at their Microsoft licensing estate, and we see what they can potentially bring to AWS and what they may need to host as license included on AWS. And the importance there really has to do with, or the reason we do that licensing health check is that we want to make sure that we're making the most out of the existing license investments that our customers have made, and we're moving everything across that we possibly can, so that you don't end up paying twice for the same license, for instance. So that's one program that we typically will start with. However, what I do want to emphasize is the very, very first thing that we always do with our customers is work backwards. So before we have that program, we of course have deeper assessments that we can do. We have storage assessments. But the first thing that we always do with our customers is really get an understanding of what their needs are, and really importantly is understanding what their long-term journey is. But more often than not, when you want to really get that first sort of foundational view of what your right-sized and optimized environment would look like on AWS, we can run what's called an optimization and licensing assessment.
That's perfect. Yes, you might know where you want to get to, but where are we actually starting from?
Yeah.
So I imagine some Microsoft Workloads customers may feel that migrating to Azure, the Microsoft Cloud, it might feel like the most natural transition. So how would you typically use the AWS OLA to present a compelling business case for migrating to AWS clouds?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think now would maybe be a good time to kind of unpack a little bit more about what that optimization and licensing assessment is, the OLA, and why we typically will use that as sort of the first step, or as you mentioned, that pre-assessment that we'll do. So the first thing I like to do is kind of take a big step back and look at the wider journey, right? When a customer migrates to AWS, the first thing we have to do is assess their environment. Then, and also when we go through the AWS migration methodology, we really have those three phases. We have assess, then we have mobilize, and that's essentially where we build the foundations of a custom. It's sort of like let's say the getting ready phase. So that's where we build out a landing zone. We start building the foundations of their actual AWS environment, and then the last step is where you actually kind of migrate and modernize. So going back to your question, what we really want to do early on in a customer's cloud journey, particularly when they are running Microsoft workloads on AWS, is doing this optimization and licensing assessment before that kind of full AWS migration methodology. Because as you said, sometimes customers will think, oh, we're hosting Windows Server, we're hosting SQL Server. It makes sense for us to go to Azure. Well, when we bring in this optimization and licensing assessment, what we actually want to do is, rather than a customer simply thinking, oh, because we have these operating systems and these database engines that are of course Microsoft technology, let's just move them onto Azure. We want to come in and say, hey, hold on, before you just sort of go and lift and shift into Azure, and you sort of take your environment as is and move it into the cloud, why don't we look at how you're actually running your environment and where you can potentially optimize, and then what that would look like on AWS. Now, the reason we do that is it's within the AWS culture to help our customers cost optimize. We've always been cost conscious. And one thing that's always been, very clear in our value proposition, whether it's, in the retail stores, our e-commerce store, as well as our AWS services, is that customers always want lower prices. So that's why we built the optimization and licensing assessment. And what we essentially do is, rather than just looking at the environment and then mapping it to AWS as is, so we run these discovery tools, and we have a few to choose from. Our own discovery tool is called the Migration Evaluator, and it's actually an agentless tool that we can run, although we also have a flat file approach that we can go for. But let's look at the example where you actually run this agentless tool. What we do is, we enable our customers, and in more cases than not, we'll actually have the help of an AWS partner like SourceFuse to set up that tool. And what it'll actually do is over the course of a time period that you assign it, we'll usually recommend a minimum of 7 days. We'll gather a full inventory, and we only gather telemetry data, by the way. We'll gather a full inventory of what the customer is running in their IT infrastructure. So we'll have the VMs, we'll have what they've actually deployed in terms of core counts and RAM, as well as storage. But then really importantly is that we're also going to gather utilization rates. And that's CPU utilization and RAM utilization. So why do we do that? Well, with that discovery tool, we can look at average utilization rates as well as the peaks. And we make sure that when we're mapping the environment to AWS, we are right-sizing those machines as well. So the reason we do that is, of course, if you're deployed on an on-premises environment, you'll always have to over-provision for peaks, right? Because the last thing you'd want is, you've purchased all your hardware, you've set up your data center, and then maybe one day you really need a lot of compute and you just don't have enough resources to support that. So that's why customers will always be over provisioned. But the beauty of the cloud, of course, is that you can scale up and scale down as needed. You can pay as you go. But of course, you can reserve some compute if it's very stable and you know that it'll always be there and it's predictable. But we want to make sure that we right-size that environment and map that to AWS. Because very often, you won't be, there's obviously we all know about technical debt, after many years of just evolving IT teams with new leaders coming in and going out, you oftentimes don't have it may have been a while before you've done an actual kind of health check and a real sort of right sizing exercise on your IT infrastructure. So rather than just customers taking their environment and putting it up into the cloud, we want to come in and say, hey, let's see how you can optimize, and let's make sure that when you are building that business case for the cloud, we're right sizing and we're optimizing as much as possible. So that's what we do on the discovery tool level. So sort of the technical assessment. Now, alongside that, if we can right size an IT infrastructure on AWS, so on Amazon EC2, which is essentially our virtual machines in the cloud, of course, any CPU optimization goes hand in hand with licensing. So what we make sure to do as well is we go in and we do a bit of a licensing health check. Now, the depth of that licensing health check can really depend. So some of our really strong Microsoft competency partners like SourceFuse can come in and give a whole range of different recommendations around what we can do to reduce licensing spend. But one of the real basic things is, okay, if we take a machine that has 4 cores, and we realize that actually we can go for a much smaller machine, let's say that has 2 vCPU on the AWS cloud, then of course you can reduce the number of Windows Server licenses that you may need. So that's what we do at the right sizing level. However, we can also come in and have a look at other best practices around Microsoft workloads in the cloud. For example, SQL Server consolidation, potential step downs, so going from SQL Server Enterprise Edition down to Standard Edition if you don't need to use all the features, or if you haven't hit all the scale limits of Enterprise Edition, making sure that you're using SQL Server Developer Edition for test and dev environments. These are all things that we can come in as part of this assessment and sort of call out and analyze. So again, we'll do that technical performance assessment where we run this discovery tooling, and then we'll do this licensing health check, and then we'll put those analyses together and then present a business case back to the customer, this sort of indicative, let's say, first pass at a business case, where we can say, hey, we believe that if you migrate your workloads to AWS, and given our technical performance assessment and our licensing health check, here are all the ways that you can save on compute and licensing. And typically what we'll see is a 36% reduction in compute costs and 45% savings in SQL cores when customers run the optimization and licensing assessment. So that's sort of where we jump in and we say, hey, before you just kind of take everything and move it into the cloud. Let's actually work backwards from your data and what you have deployed in your IT infrastructure. Let's optimize that, right size it, and see what that will look like on AWS. Because at the end of the day, we're in the business of helping our customers migrate, optimize, and then modernize in the long run.
Thanks for that, Dries. I mean, that is quite a compelling case to put forward for migrating to AWS. And those figures that you were talking about as well, those potential savings. Perhaps someone is already convinced and they don't need the business case to convince them. So they've already decided, yeah, I am going to migrate to AWS cloud. Could they simply just skip the assessment if they're that convinced?
They could. So as you know, as I mentioned, you can always just take your workloads, lift and shift it, move it into the cloud. We can of course help our customers do that, and in many cases, you might need to do that, especially if there's a real urgent, compelling event. Who knows, maybe it's a data center evacuation that needs to happen, or some sort of a disaster recovery scenario, or maybe even a hack and you need to kind of move everything into another environment. There are ways, of course, to quickly lift and shift, but would I recommend skipping it? No. And I'll say that for kind of two primary reasons. One is we want to make sure that we're setting up our customers for success. So if we can get those initial insights on average and peak utilization rates, we can already get a sense of how much we can potentially optimize once the customer is in the cloud. The second reason an optimization and licensing assessment is so important at the start of the journey is on that licensing health check piece. We really want to make sure that we're asking the right questions to understand which licenses, Microsoft licenses, and we even cover Oracle licenses as well, we can actually bring over to AWS in a compliant fashion. And that's something that oftentimes gets overlooked because it's such a complex universe, and it really is. We want to make sure that we are touching on that early on, because if you skip over that and then you get to a point where you're running your workloads on AWS and you think that, oh yeah, let's say we can just bring these SQL Server licenses over, but then maybe 2 years down the track you get audited by Microsoft and they say, hey, excuse me, you're actually not compliant right now. Now that's something that can really, of course, affect our customers, because they'll end up getting penalized by Microsoft. So we want to make sure that we are doing it as compliant in an as compliant fashion as possible from the get-go. And then the last thing I also want to mention is, being in this role now for about 2 years, I really do believe in the concept of going slow at the beginning to then go fast at the end. The more time we spend diving deep and doing our due diligence in that assess phase, the quicker and the more reliable the migration can be in further down the line. And again, it has to do with these, avoiding these unexpected surprises. So we want to make sure that from the start, we set the right expectations, we do that technical performance assessment, we do that licensing health check, so that our customer knows what they're going to expect when they move their Microsoft workloads into the cloud. So as mentioned, you may need to move very quick. So, you can of course skip the optimization and licensing assessment and move into the cloud. But would I recommend skipping it? Usually, no. I think it's always good to start with the OLA.
Oh, thanks for that explanation. That's really good. You know, when you think about the OLA, and you've talked so much about how it can provide that compelling business case and making sure that no stone is left unturned. What are some of the typical challenges or like the pushbacks that you get to hear about to getting that assessment started, and how do you overcome that?
Yeah, sure. So we'll get some pushback here and there. Typically, I must say, when our customers hear that we'll provide the tooling, that it will take 3 to 4 weeks, that it's not a heavy lift on their side, and most importantly, it's free of charge and there's no sort of commitment attached to it, we'll typically not get that much pushback. However, the usual sort of objections that we may face will revolve around, I would say the biggest one actually revolves around customer bandwidth. So just the time and effort even required to set up a discovery tool and kind of have a look through the installation guide. It takes some time, and our customers are busy. Everyone's busy, especially in tech and in IT. There's always something going on, fires that need to be put out. So they may. That's usually let's say the biggest blocker in terms, or let's say that's what usually will slow down the assessments. But that actually is where I have found that our AWS partners can really help out. So specifically SourceFuse, I have found that working with our SourceFuse team here in Australia and New Zealand can jump in and really facilitate that process. So actually being proactive and saying, hey, if bandwidth is an issue, don't worry, let's just hop on a 30-minute call. We'll help you, do the installation. You don't have to figure it out on your own, and really kind of hand-holding the customers, as much as possible. That's where partners can really help. And then partners can also help offload the bandwidth from an AWS standpoint, because they can then take those outputs from the discovery tool, from that licensing health check, and then generate the outputs. But going back to that, the actual customer bandwidth piece, also for that licensing health check, where we might find challenges is customers may not have the knowledge over their Microsoft licensing situation, and that's quite normal actually, because it's such a complex topic. But again, our partners can hop on a call. They can speak to Microsoft licensing resellers directly, or our team, like the Microsoft specialist team, we can hop on and help with that to kind of offload, the customer's efforts. So that's usually how we'll kind of help our customers from that standpoint. Another objection that I will typically see are sometimes some concerns around security. So initially, a customer might think, we don't want to install an agent on our IT infrastructure because they think that, we'll be collecting some sort of sensitive data. But the first point is actually that, yes, we have agent-based tooling, but we also have agent-less tooling. So there's always the agentless option. But then even if just collecting telemetry data, because we don't go any further than that, or even sharing, let's say, metadata of our customers, virtual machines, for example, like let's say server names, if they're not comfortable with sharing that, that's totally fine as well. We always have an option to just go for a flat file ingest approach. So for that kind of assessment methodology, we simply share a data import template, and then the customer can be fully in control of the data that they share with us. And they would actually manually put in the specs and the utilization rates that we would take into account to build the business case. And if they'd like, they can anonymize their server names, and that's totally fine. So there's always a way around security concerns. It's really just a matter of getting the right specialist on the call, the right partner on the call, and we can always generate the right outputs for our customers. So I would say those are kind of the two biggest ones, and usually the ones that that come up the most. And in both cases, it's really just about having the right partner on the call to help work around that.
Yeah, so bandwidth. I had bandwidth skills and knowing the right tools. Security. You said you had hundreds of AWS tools and services that can all help with this process as well. So you mentioned about the collaboration with partners like ourselves. So how does this partnership, the AWS and SourceFuse partnership, further benefit our customers looking to migrate workloads to the cloud?
So, I think we could talk about this for days, because there's so many ways that a partner can help. But actually, very similar to the topics that I just mentioned, I would say if we were to just really boil it down to kind of some of the key ones, I would say firstly is velocity. So if you have a partner in the conversation that knows what they're talking about, that have specialist or specialized expertise in the workloads that you're dealing with, I mean, they've done this migration hundreds of times. Can you imagine if you were to just complete a migration, let's say self-service, that the customer does it themselves? There'd be so much trial and error, research, learning on the job. But if you bring in a partner who knows what they're doing, have done this hundreds of times, then they can come in and just quickly execute. Now the next one is, of course, being able to bring new knowledge to the table. So coming in as an expert, and particularly when you're moving into the cloud, it doesn't just end at the migration. Partners like SourceFuse also understand the value of modernizing. So I've mentioned modernizing a few times. I know that SourceFuse also in your previous episodes you've talked about modernizing, a lot. I'm sure, but just to recap within the context of Microsoft workloads, what we're really talking about here is breaking free from commercial licensing, and moving to more cloud native, serverless technologies, moving towards modern apps and microservices. These are all things that a partner can come in and say, in some cases they might just, look at an application, see the way it's built, and actually suggest, why don't we actually take this app and look at potentially modernizing it, moving it to, let's say, moving from SQL Server to Amazon Aurora for Postgres. Like this sort of depth of knowledge, around the AWS cloud, I would say is the other kind of key way that a partner can help, even as early on as the optimization and licensing assessment, to say, hey, okay, sure, we're doing this assessment, we're getting this initial business case, but here's some things that we'd like you to think about. Here's some ways that we'd like to challenge your strategy to think about modernizing in the long run. And then what I would say is sort of the other key point here, and again, I'm mentioning all these things from direct experience that I've had with SourceFuse, is enhancing the output. So what we don't want to be here at AWS, and the way we don't want to work with partners, is being real cookie cutter. We don't want to just say, oh, you want to move to the cloud? Great, run this tool, fill in this questionnaire, here's an estimate, and off you go. No, once again, we want to work backwards from our customers. We want to spend that time understanding what their long-term strategy is and what their ideal end state is. And then we want to generate an output that makes sense for their strategy. Now, of course, we can, generate those outputs using a discovery tool, and we have our licensing health check, and we can do sort of the standard output. But where I've seen SourceFuse really go above and beyond is they go further than that. They can fill the gaps. They can enhance the business case. They, I have multiple examples where they've actually gone and added an extra lens to the optimization and licensing assessment outputs to actually understand what the business case would be to modernize in the long run and actually go more cloud native and move away from SQL Server and move to open source. And then the last piece that I really want to emphasize as well, although I'm still trying to keep it related to this pre-assessment phase, is enablement. So we can generate numbers, we can provide estimates which could look good, like, oh yeah, I think we'll save money by moving to the cloud. But where partners can really come in is more of the education aspect of understanding, helping us communicate to our customers why it's important for their business. And then once they actually do migrate, they can literally enable them to run their technologies on AWS and actually enable them on, train them and get them familiar with the AWS console and get them to be autonomous in the long run. That being said, of course, there is also the option, which is equally beneficial, is if a customer wants to migrate and then actually have SourceFuse manage everything for them, then they of course have that managed service option, which is another massive win, because you're now having your environment, your environment is now being managed by that partner that built your migration strategy in the first place. So we're landing them in this AWS environment that from the get-go has been built by SourceFuse and then will be managed by them as well. So whether it's enabling customers or actually SourceFuse coming in and managing the environment for them, I would say is another huge benefit. Because what I can say is, the last thing you want to do is handovers. So, and that's from one partner to another or from AWS to a partner. We could start building a business case and a strategy. And then, we may introduce SourceFuse a little bit later into the picture, but then, they'll just sort of have to deal with what we've provided them with. However, if you bring in SourceFuse right at the beginning, the right AWS partner for this migration, for this segment and this use case, then they can build that business case with the long-term strategy in the long run, and they will also be the entity that executes that migration and manages the infrastructure. So the earlier that you bring them in, the more you set up the customer for success in the long run, and the more you can allow that seamless and pleasant journey into the cloud. So I've touched on a number of different things, but that's, I suppose at a high level how I would see our AWS partners and specifically SourceFuse helping out our customers.
That was really, really good summary there, Dries. Thank you. And yeah, I think our end goal is to make this the smoothest journey for the customers at the end of the day. So coming back to the assessment and the OLA, how do you see the OLA evolving in the future?
So what I've already seen, from my years here at AWS and back in 2020 when I first started, working with the optimization and licensing assessment with my customers, it first launched in 2019. I first started working with it, just a few months later in 2020. Back then, we really only had one discovery tool that we would use, and we only focused on migrating Microsoft workloads. Since then until now, it's expanded so much. So we have multiple kind of discovery tools that our customers can choose from. We have a way bigger partner network now that can execute on these optimization and licensing assessments. But more importantly, the source workloads and the target workloads have expanded as well. So we can now not just run, discovery tooling for Microsoft workload migrations. We also support Oracle. We can do some analysis with IBM workloads. We do storage assessments. Typically, our discovery tooling was for x86 or infrastructure as a service environments. But now we have tooling that can help with cloud to cloud assessments. And then the output now, rather than just kind of mapping to infrastructure as a service on Amazon EC2, we now map to more of our PaaS services. So our relational database service, for example, some more of our native storage services, and then, of course, Amazon EC2. We can also run optimization and licensing assessments on existing EC2 workloads to help our customers modernize or to help our customers cost optimize, excuse me. So what I would say, or kind of where I'm getting at here, is I think that the OLA is only going to get broader in terms of scope. And not only that, I think so broader in terms of scope of the types of environments that we can analyze or that we can assess. And then I think that the outputs will also become broader. I think we'll be able to get more specific, we'll be able to get more accurate, and we'll be able to get more flexible in the type of end state that we can map to. Because that's changed as well, right? It used to be just Amazon EC2. Now we can also start, especially with the help of SourceFuse, for example, we can map more towards those hypothetical end states where we've modernized our customers' environments. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that. So a lot more source environments that we can assess, and a lot more complex end states and outputs that we'll be able to present back to our customers. And at the end of the day, that's what we'd like to do. We'd like to be able to very early on, with very little effort, show the possible and give them a little snippet of what the future of their IT infrastructure could look like.
I love that. Did you say art of the possible?
Yes, the art of the
I love
possible.
that. um, So, yeah, a huge thank you for sharing your insights with us today, Dries. It's been fascinating going right back to that starting point and really focusing on that. So, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about what I do, and it's especially a pleasure getting to do this for one of the AWS partners that I definitely like working with the most, and that consistently also delivers the highest quality outputs in my engagements.
Thanks, Dries. Always a pleasure. And thanks, as always, to our audience as well for watching. Be sure to like and share this video, catch up with all our previous chats, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss the next Talking Out Cloud with SourceFuse.